The hardest thing about getting old isn't the wrinkles or the forgotten names. It's the quiet erasure of your past. My daughter Sarah used to call me Mom, a name that felt like home. But on my 65th birthday, she introduced me to her new lawyer, a man who didn't know me from Adam. "This is Eleanor," she said, her voice bright and professional. "A family friend." The words were a quiet jab, a subtle shifting of my role. In that moment, I wasn't her mother anymore. I was just a footnote in her life, a relic from a past she was eager to leave behind. I smiled, swallowed the bitter taste, and held my head high. Little did I know, that was only the beginning of her plan to erase me completely. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd consider subscribing to my channel, it would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Eleanor Vance. It's a name that now feels both familiar and brand new, like a favorite dress I've worn 1,000 times that has been subtly altered to no longer fit. For 65 years, I was a wife, a mother, and a teacher, and my life felt as comfortable as an old chair. My world was small but deeply meaningful, built on the quiet streets of a California suburb, in a 2-story house with a white picket fence. My husband, David, and I had cultivated not just a garden there, but a life rich with small moments and shared dreams. When he passed 5 years ago, a piece of me went with him, leaving a void that was both a heavy sorrow and a silent space where I had to learn how to be just Eleanor. My daughter, Sarah, a spectacularly ungrateful architect in Manhattan, saw my grief not as an ache, but as an opportunity. "Mom, you can't possibly manage this big house alone," she'd say, her voice as smooth and polished as the expensive stones she designed with, the stairs, the maintenance, all those memories. "It's not healthy. You need a fresh start." Her concern was a facade, a carefully constructed one, designed to hide the ruthless calculation behind her eyes. She'd always been her father's princess, his favorite, and he had spoiled her with a devotion that I now see blinded him to her true nature. When she proposed I sell the house to invest in her new, groundbreaking business venture, I saw it as her way of keeping me close, of making me a part of her big, exciting life. So, I agreed. The house, our biggest shared memory, sold for a staggering $33 million. It was a sum I couldn't even comprehend, a fortune I was more than happy to put in my daughter's hands. The day the transaction was complete, Sarah flew back home for a celebratory dinner. She brought a bottle of wine, a designer scarf, and a business card for a lawyer she'd hired. "We'll set up a joint account for the funds," she explained, her voice all business. "It'll make it easier to manage the investments." That night, she told me she had bought a penthouse in Manhattan, and as I walked through it for the first time, a framed photo of David and me on the mantel caught my eye. I smiled, thinking that she still had a place for us in her heart. But then she walked over to it, took it off the mantel, and put it in a drawer. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "This is my new life now, and I want it to be a fresh start." The words, so casually spoken, were a quiet jab, a subtle shifting of my role in that moment. I wasn't her mother anymore. I was just a footnote in her life, a relic from a past she was eager to leave behind. It began with a subtle erasure. She stopped calling me Mom and began to address me by my first name, Eleanor, in the same professional tone she used for her associates. When she introduced me, she'd say, "This is Eleanor," and then add with a dismissive wave, "A friend of the family," each time. A new layer of my identity was peeled away. My heart ached, but I swallowed my pride. I didn't want to cause any problems or get in the way of her success. 2 months went by, and the calls stopped. My texts went unanswered. When I went to her office building in Manhattan, the doorman stopped me, his face impassive. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, "but Miss Vance has left strict instructions that you are not allowed to come here anymore." My heart sank. I felt a cold dread creep into my veins. This wasn't just a busy child neglecting her mother. This was a deliberate, calculated campaign to make me disappear. Eleanor's peaceful, quiet life was shattered the moment Sarah's gentle persuasion turned into a cold, relentless campaign. The subject of our home, once a sanctuary, became a battlefield. Sarah would call me daily, her voice a relentless tide of logic and ambition. Mom, the market is at an all-time high. This house is a dead asset, an expensive liability, she'd argue, her words devoid of any emotional weight. It's worth $33 million. Just sitting there? Think of what we could do with that money. I tried to reason with her, my voice small and trembling. But Sarah, this isn't just a house, it's our home. Your father and I built our lives here. Every room holds a memory. I would tell her about David's old rocking chair on the porch where he used to read, or the kitchen where we'd bake cookies together. But my memories meant nothing to her. She saw them not as cherished treasures, but as burdens holding me back. The pressure mounted until I felt like I was suffocating. Sarah's tone grew colder, her disappointment a tangible presence even over the phone line. "Mom, you're not just holding back my future," she finally said, her voice sharp and cutting. "You're clinging to the past. Don't you want to be a part of my legacy?" That was her ultimate weapon, an appeal to my deepest desire to remain an essential part of her life. I felt a desperate, irrational fear that if I didn't give her what she wanted, she would abandon me completely. The day I signed the papers, a part of me died. I watched as our family home was transferred to a faceless corporation, the check a staggering number on a white slip of paper. I handed it all to Sarah, my hands shaking. She took it without a word, a single, triumphant smirk on her face. "Don't worry, Mom," she said. "You're a part of the trust now. I'll handle everything." For weeks, I tried to reach her. My calls went to voicemail. My texts went unanswered. When I flew to New York, I found her apartment building. The doorman, a stern man in a crisp uniform, barred my way. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, "but miss, Vance has left explicit instructions that you are not to be admitted." My heart sank. This wasn't just neglect. It was a deliberate, calculated act of erasure. The final blow came the next day. I went to the bank to check on my account, the one I had opened after selling the house. The teller looked at me with a pained expression. "I'm so sorry, ma'am, but your account has been closed. All funds were transferred to a new account, and you are not listed as a signatory." My breath caught in my throat. I called Sarah immediately, my hands trembling. This time, she answered. Her voice was cold, distant, and utterly devoid of warmth. "It's about time you stopped bothering me," she said. "You're useless now. I've sent a car to take you to a retirement home. Goodbye." The line went dead. The silence was deafening, a final, cruel act of betrayal. I stood there, an obedient mother who had packed her life into 2 suitcases, now homeless and penniless, a ghost in my own daughter's new, beautiful world. I felt torn in half, as if one part of me had been left behind on a desolate road. After Sarah's call, I stood on the sidewalk, my suitcases heavy in my hands, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. I had no money, no home, and nowhere to go. Despite the shock, I held on to a last flicker of hope. I remember David, my dear husband, had given me a key and told me I could seek help at the law office he trusted most. I walked all night to get there. Mr. Harrison's office was small and unassuming, but it felt like a sanctuary. He was a kind man, with warm eyes and a gentle smile. I recounted the entire story to him, from the selling of the house to Sarah's theft of the money and her final, cruel dismissal. He listened patiently, his expression unwavering. When I finished, he took a deep breath and said, "I am so sorry for what happened to you, but I can help. I have a copy of your husband's will, the original one, the one your daughter didn't want you to see." He handed me a crisp, official-looking document. My hands trembled as I read the words on the page. David had left everything to a charity. with the explicit condition that I was allowed to live in our house for the rest of my life. This will prove that Sarah had not only stolen my money, but had also forged my husband's will. The betrayal was so deep, so absolute, that I could barely comprehend it. This was no longer just about money. It was about years of manipulation, years of believing her lies. It was about a daughter who saw her own mother not as a person, but as an obstacle to be removed. Mr. Harrison explained that David's original will had been written more than 20 years ago. David wanted to ensure that I would always have a roof over my head, with the remainder of his estate to be passed to a charity. However, Sarah had created and used a fraudulent will to claim all of David's assets for herself. I had never imagined my daughter could do this to me. I was devastated. But Mr. Harrison reassured me. He said we had enough evidence to challenge Sarah and reclaim what was rightfully mine. I filed a lawsuit against her, and she was furious. She screamed, "How could you do this to me? I'm your daughter." I said nothing, I just looked at her. And she knew that I was done. She knew that I was going to fight her for what was mine. This wasn't just a battle for money. It was a battle for truth, for justice, and for my dignity. In the days that followed, I worked with Mr. Harrison to gather evidence. We found phone records, emails, and bank documents that proved Sarah had intentionally defrauded me and stolen my assets. I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't give up. I had to fight for myself, for other women who had been exploited like me, and for what was right. And with that forged will in my hands, a fire ignited inside me. The tears stopped, the fear vanished. All that was left was a cold, pure rage, a single-minded determination I hadn't felt since I was a young woman fighting for my own future. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about my husband's memory and my own dignity. Sarah had not just stolen my wealth. She had tried to erase my entire identity and rewrite my past. I would not let her get away with it. Mr. Harrison, my new lawyer, a man whose kindness belied his sharp legal mind, looked at me with a steady gaze. "Are you sure you want to proceed? This will be a fight. She won't give up easily." I met his eyes, my voice as steady as his. "I have nothing to lose. Let's do it." The first salvo was fired when the legal papers were served. I imagined the look on Sarah's face, the shock, the anger, the cold realization that her useless mother was now her greatest adversary. The lawsuit was a precise surgical strike, exposing her fraudulent will and detailing her elaborate plan to defraud me. She called me, not with an apology, but with a torrent of insults and threats. "How dare you?" she screamed, her voice a shrill, hysterical shriek. "After everything I've done for you, this is insane. I'll ruin you, you pathetic old woman." I said nothing, listening to her venom, feeling nothing but a profound emptiness where my love for her used to be. The woman on the phone was a stranger. "I'm not Margaret anymore," I finally said, my voice quiet, cutting through her hysteria. "My name is Eleanor." The court dates were a blur of cold rooms and colder faces. Sarah's lawyers, slick and arrogant, tried to portray me as a confused, senile widow being manipulated by a greedy attorney. But Mr. Harrison was a bulldog. He presented the original will, a document with David's unmistakable signature. Then came the damning evidence, the phone records, the emails, and the bank transfers. All a digital breadcrumb trail leading directly back to Sarah. The air in the courtroom grew thick with tension as her lawyer's confident smirks turned into panicked whispers. Sarah's arrogance began to crack. She watched me from across the room, her eyes wide with a desperate animal fear. The polished facade she had spent years building was crumbling before my eyes. The girl who had told me I was a relic from a past she was eager to leave behind was now trapped in a present of her own making. The court hearings dragged on for days, each one a relentless hammering of the truth that shattered her carefully constructed lies. She tried to deny everything, but the facts were undeniable. The truth was not a matter of opinion. It was a matter of record. And then, on the third day of the final hearing, the call came. My phone, which had been silent for months, vibrated with a ringtone I had forgotten. It was Sarah. I looked at the screen, a new kind of power surging through me. I let it ring once, then twice, before I answered. Her voice, once so full of contempt, was now a trembling, desperate plea. "Mom, please," she sobbed, the perfect poise completely gone. "You have to help me. The police, they're here. They're saying this is money laundering, and they're going to arrest me. Kevin has a lawyer for himself, but I don't have anyone. Please, I need you. I'm begging you. You have to save me." Her words were a tidal wave of panic and fear, washing over me. This was the moment she had reduced our relationship to a transaction. She was no longer calling me her mother. She was calling me a lifeline. My mind replayed her words, her cruel laughter, her face as she had put our picture in a drawer. I thought of the long, cold walks through the city, the nights I had spent on a bench, a nameless, worthless widow in her eyes. I had been a pawn in her game. But she was about to learn that sometimes the pawn becomes the queen. I took a deep breath, and a profound, bone-deep sense of peace settled over me. I wasn't her mother anymore. I was Eleanor. My voice, when it came, was calm, steady, and utterly final. "You made your choices, Sarah," I said. "Now you have to live with them." Without another word, I hung up. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of a quiet, powerful freedom. The moment I hung up the phone, a profound silence descended upon me. It wasn't the empty, crushing silence of despair I had known for months, but a new, powerful silence, the kind that fills a space after a storm has passed. There was no shaking, no tears, no triumphant joy, just a bone-deep sense of peace. The woman on the other end of the line was a stranger, a panicked voice begging for a lifeline that no longer existed. The Eleanor she had known, the mother who would have sacrificed everything, was gone. I felt an immense sense of liberation, as if I had finally escaped a cage I didn't even realize I had been in. With the lawsuit settled and the money from the penthouse secured, I was no longer a victim. I was a victor. I didn't want to simply get my life back. I wanted to build a new one. I used the money not to buy back the past, but to create a future for others. I founded the Eleanor Vance Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to assisting women who had been financially and emotionally abused by their own families. The first office was small, just 2 rooms in a community center, but it was a beacon of hope. My first clients were widows whose children had taken advantage of their grief, and elderly women who had been coerced into signing over their life savings. I listened to their stories, and for the first time, I wasn't just hearing a different version of my own pain, I was seeing a new kind of purpose. My days became a blur of consultations, workshops, and speaking engagements. I taught these women how to regain control of their finances, how to navigate legal systems, and most importantly, how to reclaim their dignity. I showed them that their worth wasn't tied to their wealth or their family connections, but to their inherent strength and resilience. I became a different person. My posture straightened. The fear that used to live in my eyes was replaced with a steady, compassionate strength. I started painting again. Not the landscapes I used to love, but portraits of the women I met, each one a testament to their quiet courage. My self-portrait, the one I had started in my small art studio, was no longer a sad, grieving widow. The woman in the painting looked powerful, independent, and unafraid. She looked like someone who had learned that the best revenge isn't about getting even, but about becoming everything your enemies never thought you could be. The whispers in my head, the ones that used to tell me I was useless and a burden, were finally silent. My life was no longer defined by my relationship with my daughter, but by the community of women I had built around me. We were a tribe of survivors, bound not by blood, but by shared experience and a common goal of healing. I learned to trust again, to laugh freely, and to live fully. I traveled, not on a cruise to forget my past, but to conferences to share my story and inspire others. My old life had been a series of small sacrifices for a person who never appreciated them. My new life was a series of small triumphs for women who needed me. Months later, a letter arrived. It was from Sarah. I recognized her handwriting instantly. It was a long letter, filled with empty apologies and hollow words about finding God and learning her lesson in prison. She asked for my forgiveness and for me to visit her. I read it and then placed it gently on the kitchen counter. I didn't tear it up or throw it away. I just left it there. A relic from a past that no longer held any power over me. I had considered visiting her, but I knew what it would be, a performance. She would beg for forgiveness, and I would be left to wonder if it was genuine. I wasn't willing to risk my newfound peace. I had forgiven myself, and that was all that mattered. My journey wasn't about erasing Sarah from my life, but about carving out a space for myself where she no longer existed. I had defended my home, not just the physical house, but my inner sanctum. I had learned that my worth was not something to be inherited or given by others, but something I had to build and defend myself through intelligence and courage. I was finally free. And if Sarah ever wanted to rebuild a relationship with this woman, she would have to bring a lot more than prison letters and hollow apologies. She would have to bring a complete transformation, one that matched my own.